skeptical of whether Congaree deserved to be a national park. But what I discovered is that my colleague Wade Worthen had been down there writing about the diversity of insects. And he introduced me to the fact that the insects he likes are the ones that are the killers, but they don't kill people. They kill other insects that try to kill people. And mostly we're talking about a group of insects that are headlined by the dragonflies. So you're going to be hearing from a guy that knows more about dragonflies than but a handful of people in the world. He may talk about them today, we'll see. He's well educated in the Northeast with his Ph.D. from the State University of New Jersey, Rutgers, just a magnificent facility. He came to Furman in 1988 when we met and had a good publication record to begin with, but he effectively publishes with probably 50 of his students, undergraduate students, over these last 30 plus years. In 2006, as Furman was stepping up its environmental game, creating what was called the Year of the Environment, Wade reminded us that the Furman Lake, the signature scene on campus that I hope every one of you has seen and walked around, smelled like a cesspool and either needed to be closed down or restored. And he presented to us during that year a plan for lake restoration that has brought the campus back in incredible ways. So thank you, Wade. I have swum in the lake several times since then, but not in the mid-2000s. Oh yes, now you can, but I will say in the mid-2000s, you didn't want to. And I learned more about goose poop and feeding homeless people Canada geese and how you trap them and cook them. And but the guy knows a lot about the interaction of organisms and their environment, and that's what an ecologist does. I think I'm going to say nothing more except that we are really fortunate that you came from your lab today as an active professor and drove from Furman to this area to speak to us. But I'm excited to learn more from you yet again. So Wade Worthen.
Well, I'd like to thank Frank for that warm introduction. We certainly do go back a ways, and thanks for reminding me about the Year of the Environment. Frank headed up the Year of the Environment, and we were all sitting around, and I said, well, we really ought to clean up the lake. And he said, good idea, Wade, you're in charge. So thank you all for coming tonight. I'm very excited to be here with the Foothills group of the Sierra Club. I'm going to get started, but I think what I'd like to do for the is just reduce this, because I'm going to have stuff on my presentation that are going to take the whole screen. So my talk is our vanishing diversity and how to save it. I'll get right on with it. I'm going to talk about what biodiversity is, why it's important, how it's doing, and how we can preserve it. Now, when we say biodiversity, you all know, we're just talking about the variety of living things. But we can think of that variety at different scales. So we can think of genetic diversity within a species. All of these butterflies, though they look different, are all members of the same species. What we see is variation between different populations. They live in different regions of the Amazon basin with different species of other toxic butterflies. And in a given region, those species will converge on kind of a common signal, a common morphology that all the birds will avoid. And so what we see is this variation is really in response to differences in the biotic environment. There are adaptations to differences in the biotic environment. Of course, we have species diversity, within a community. And we happen to live in a biological hotspot, the Southern Appalachians, where there's the highest diversity of salamanders in the whole world. 30 species of salamanders, and these different salamander species are adapted to different microenvironments and feed on slightly different prey. Some even eat other salamanders. So again, we see this variation as adaptation to different biotic and abiotic environments. We also have variation in community diversity within biomes. So we're within the biome of the eastern deciduous forest, which runs from southern Maine across to the Midwest and down to the Gulf. The different colors that you see represent the different community types of trees that dominate in those different areas. So although white oak probably runs throughout the eastern deciduous forest, its relative abundance varies under different climatic conditions that we get as a consequence of moving from the coastal plain to the Piedmont to the higher elevations of the Appalachian Mountains. Again, these differences, this variation is due to adaptations to different environmental conditions. And then finally, of course, at the largest scale, the planetary scale, we have different biomes. And when we think of different biomes, we're really thinking of communities dominated by completely different growth forms of plants, like grasslands or deciduous forests or evergreen tropical forests in the equator or evergreen forests in the boreal forest. And again, this variation is due to adaptations to these differences in the planetary environment. Well, at every scale, as I've suggested, this variation represents adaptations to spatial variation in the environment, from a microhabitat to a habitat to even a planetary scale. But it's important to appreciate that that variation also represents extraordinary genetic potential to adapt and persist as environments change through time. And I'll be coming back to that point in the future. And we can think of the reverse pattern. The loss of diversity then increases vulnerability to change, both within populations as a genetic level, but also at a community and biome level. Now, you might think this is kind of a sterile scientific way to describe this biodiversity. There are other ways that we can describe it. We can describe genetic diversity within a species as flavors, different flavors that enrich our life. We can describe species diversity in a community as the extraordinary range of beauty that we see. There's 1 million described species of insects, probably 10 times as many, 1/2 of all named species that show extraordinary beauty in their colors. With respect to community diversity in a biome, you're members of the Sierra Club. You're inspired by the grandeur of nature, by walking through a redwood forest. And of course, at a planetary scale, the sum total of diversity that we see, I think, is the most remarkable product in the known universe. It's the only planet where life exists, and it exists in such extraordinary diversity. It's so special. From rainforests to reefs, from deserts to deep sea vent systems. Well, why is it important? Well, again, I'm kind of speaking to the choir here. You can think of 3 reasons. Utilitarian reasons. We certainly use different species for drugs, food, clothes, and shelter. That makes them important to us. But you all know it's important to us for personal reasons, for psychological reasons, that we evolved in nature and we are most human in nature. We are psychologically healthy in nature, and we need it to be healthy. What I'm going to focus tonight on are the ecological reasons, why we need to maintain it, to maintain the environmental conditions on the earth that we need to survive as a species. if we look at our immediate neighbors, Venus to the right and Mars to the left, that's to scale. You know, it might be a little surprising that Mars is so much smaller than Earth and Venus. They're radically different, and they're different because of both the biosphere and, of course, that Earth is covered by 75% water. And those two differences contribute to other differences in these planetary systems. So if we look at the composition of the atmospheres, Venus and Mars are quite similar, with atmospheres dominated by carbon dioxide. Earth formed at the same time out of the same stuff. Early atmosphere was probably very similar. Why is it so different now? Why is there so little CO2 in the atmosphere? Well, 75% of the planet's covered by water, and CO2 dissolves in water, and then it can precipitate out as limestone with calcium that's eroded from the rocks. Most of the carbon in the Earth system now is in carbonate rocks. It's been transferred from the atmosphere to the lithosphere. But of course, the biosphere has contributed as well, because all of life is carbon-based life form. So the biosphere represents carbon taken out of the atmosphere to build our organic molecules. And since most of the biosphere, the living biomass on the planet, is photosynthetic plants, we also not only have CO2 being drawn out, but you know that, of course, that oxygen that represents the other major difference in the Earth system compared to our neighbors is due exclusively to the production of photosynthesis. So the biosphere is critical and has been critical in making the Earth different and keeping it the way that it is now. And we can see this today. I mean, one of the most, I'm going to probably say that a lot because I've put together all the stuff that I think is the most like inspiring, is that we can see the Earth breathe as a planet. So what we're looking at is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over a 3-year period. And each year, from April to October, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is dropping. And the reason is that that's summer in the northern hemisphere. And so you can see that most of the terrestrial biosphere is in the northern hemisphere. So as the northern hemisphere is in its growing season, CO2 is drawn out of the atmosphere by those plants when photosynthesis exceeds respiration. And then in the growing season of the southern hemisphere, although the southern hemisphere is photosynthesizing more than it's respiring, the respiration of the northern hemisphere exceeds that. And so we have essentially the northern hemisphere exhaling that CO2 to the atmosphere. So we see the Earth as a planet literally breathing. It's a living, breathing system. And to change that biosphere is going to change how our planetary system functions. You know, Frank and Bill and I and any of the others in the room who have taught students appreciate their optimism and you know, the way they want to save the world, save the planet. And so we got a lot of idealistic students at Furman too. They want to save the environment. They want to save the environment, and so we have clean water, so we have clean air, so we have healthy soils for food production. And I tell them, you want to save the environment, you got to save the functionality of the biosphere, because the biosphere is what's doing those things for us. You want to save the functionality of the biosphere, biodiversity influences the functionality of the biosphere. What is that functionality? Well, the biosphere increases, biodiversity increases the productivity of the biosphere, how much biomass, living biomass, is produced each year. And as I'll show you, biodiversity also increases the stability of that productivity. We don't want our productivity, which is the food, our food, and the food for all the other living things on the planet, to be a boom-bust cycle where we go through famines periodically. We want that to be a stable, high productivity of biomass. And I'm going to show you that productivity satisfies both of these requirements. I'm going to use a couple of examples One example from indigenous cultures that you're probably aware of, showing that biodiversity increases productivity. So think about you're a farmer, let's say, and you want to produce as much food as you can for the human population. You know that different crops produce different amounts of food per unit surface area per acre. So you know, you're an ethical person. You want to produce as much food as you can. So it seems logical that you should pick the species that is most productive, and you should plant your whole field in that species. A monoculture, the most productive species. How could it be otherwise? How could you reduce the amount of corn you produce and plant something that's less productive and expect to generate more food? Well, the Cherokee and the Iroquois learned something different. They knew that if you just plant one species, you're going to have to plant them fairly far apart, because each individual in this single species requires the same mix of nutrients and are going to compete with one another if you overcrowd them. So you're going to have to spread them out a little bit. But still, nonetheless, they're our most productive species. Let's call it corn. Well, the Iroquois knew that, well, let's reduce the amount of corn. Let's spread them out a little further, because we're going to fit another plant in there. So I'm getting less corn because I've only got 4 corn stalks. But I can plant squash. And I can plant squash and corn much closer together, because the squash and corn are not going to compete for the same amount of nutrients, the same type of nutrients, the same amount and type of light. And the squash with their broad leaves will actually keep the soil moist too. So although there's a decrease in the productivity of corn, since you can plant these 2 species closer together, you can compensate, in fact, overcompensate for the decrease in corn by the amount of food you get in squash. And this is because these 2 species have complementary niches. They're not identical niches, they're different niches that can fit together. Now there's a third species that's involved here, as you probably know, and those are beans. Well, beans are legumes, and legumes fertilize the soil naturally. They fix nitrogen, they take nitrogen out of the air, and they can split those 2 nitrogen atoms apart, which is a very unusual chemical trick that only a few bacteria can do. But then those nitrogen atoms can interact with hydrogen and oxygen and can be absorbed by plants as ammonia and nitrite compounds. So they fertilize the soil for the other plants. So you get a little bit more corn when the beans are planted. You get a little bit more squash, and you get beans. So in this polyculture, these 3 species growing together as a result of complementary niches and positive effects of some species having a beneficial effect on others, the polyculture is actually more productive than a plot of the most productive monoculture. Counterintuitive. But why do we plant then the entire Midwest in corn? It's because there are economies of scale, and a single crop is easier to harvest with a huge combine. But in terms of per acre productivity, polycultures win out. And of course, these 3 species are known as the 3 sisters in Iroquois and Cherokee culture because they work so well together. So this is my first example. We'll switch now to an example from the scientific community that demonstrates many of the same principles. And that is a study area in Minnesota, central Minnesota. It's called the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve. And David Tillman, a community ecologist, established these plots back in the 80s. And they took a patch of farmland. They actually nearly sterilized the soil. They eliminated the seed bank that's present in the soil. And they established these plots 9 meters square. Excuse me. Then in each plot, they planted a random set of species pulled from a pool of 18 Midwestern species, native species, 4 species of C4 grasses, 4 species of C3 grasses, 4 species of legumes, 4 species of non-legumes, and a couple woody species. So that's the pool of species they're going to draw from. And they came to the first plot and they said, all right, how many species are going to go in this plot? And they randomly decided 4 species are going to go in this plot. So then from their pool of 18, they randomly selected 4 species, planted those 4 species in this one plot. Come to the second plot. All right, how many species go in this one? 4 species, okay. Randomly selected a different set of 4 species. So across the entire field, there are 35 replicates of single species diversity plots, 35 plots that contain 2 species, but of course different pair of 2 species, 4 species, 8 and 16. And over the course of the last 40 years, Tillman and his graduate students and other members of University of Minnesota's ecology department have worked this system to death, asking just about every question you can possibly ask of the effect of diversity on different aspects of ecosystem productivity, health, resistance, stability, so forth, to the tune of 854 publications on this system in 40 years, 20 a year. That's pretty productive research program. So let's take a look at some of the patterns they found. So what we're looking at here is above ground biomass across our different species diversity treatments, 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16, and total biomass down the bottom, and of course includes the roots and below ground biomass. So the first thing that you can see is there's a positive correlation between species diversity in these plots and total biomass productivity. So indeed, more diverse communities on average produce more biomass, but there's a lot of variation. Now there's, of course, think about the single species plots here. These are our single species plots, and just like with corn, as you would expect, they're not all equally productive. There's a species that is more productive than the others. So that species is our most productive monoculture. Single species treatment, and that was its productivity more so than any of the others. So that gray line represents our standard, our most productive monoculture. Well, boy, there sure are a lot of dots above that gray line at higher levels of diversity. Every dot above that gray line is a polyculture that's producing more biomass than the most productive monoculture, just like our 3 sisters did. And in fact, you can see that when you get to the highest diversity plots, oftentimes it's the majority of polycultures that are more productive than the most productive monoculture. Biodiversity increases productivity. And what's equally amazing here, of course, this has to be due then to niche complementarity or positive effects. But what's equally amazing is, remember, these are random assemblages of species, just chosen at random from that pool of 18. We could imagine that communities that have evolved together and have evolved to partition resources in the face of competition and develop their own levels of niche complementation would be even more likely to be more productive than a random assemblage of 16 species drawn by chance. In addition, biodiversity increases stability. So increases resistance to foliar fungal diseases. So here's our pathogen load, the amount of foliar fungus found on the leaves of the plants in these plots. There's a significant negative correlation with diversity. And they explain it in that, well, in a monoculture, Every infected plant is surrounded by neighbors of the same species that are equally vulnerable. So an infection can spread rapidly from neighbor to neighbor. Whereas in a polyculture, an infected plant of one species might not have another member of that species as an immediate neighbor. It's surrounded by other individuals that are not susceptible to that particular species specific disease. It's the same reason we vaccinate. We vaccinate so that an individual that is infected is unlikely to come into contact with another vulnerable individual if everybody in between is vaccinated. It's called the dilution effect. In addition, biodiversity increases stability by increasing resistance to invasive species. So this is now 2000, so 15 years after the plots were established. And Sahid Neem went in and decided, well, what we're going to do is we're going to seed some of these plots with 2 invasive species, non-native species to the upper Midwest. And then look at the success of those invasive species in the plots of different diversity. Well, as you can see, the biomass of the invasive species drops dramatically as the diversity of the system increases. More diverse systems are less susceptible to invasive species. They attributed it to 2 factors. More diverse communities have a higher density of plants, because like the squash and the corn, different species can grow closer together and create a higher density of plant biomass. In addition, the invasive species is trying to invade a community in which its niche might already be occupied in a diverse community, but vacant in a low diversity system. So the probability that our invasive species can catch hold in a low diversity system is higher than in a high diversity system where that niche might already be occupied. In addition, we see higher resistance to drought. So there was a drought in 88. And what they looked at was, well, how much biodiversity was produced in these plots during the drought relative to the biodiversity that was produced 2 years earlier before the drought. During the drought, low diversity communities only produced about a 16th to an 8th of the biomass that they produced before the drought. Whereas high diversity communities produced about half the biomass during the drought as they did before. So the higher diversity communities were more resistant to the drought. They could weather that storm better. In addition, they're more resilient to climate change. So what we're looking at here are our different diversity treatments, numbers of species and plots. And within there are 4 bars, and they are ambient CO2 levels and ambient nitrogen, all the way through the dark bar, which is elevated CO2. They literally pump CO2 into the plot, and nitrogen addition. The high diversity plots could respond to increased CO2 levels much better. The slope of these green lines is much steeper than the slope of the orange. So the high diversity plots could absorb that extra CO2 better than the low diversity plots. In addition, that figure shows carbon storage on the y-axis and number of species on the x. Carbon storage is greater in higher diversity communities. We're worried about where all our extra CO2 is going. Biodiversity can help us absorb some of that if we would give it a chance. So biodiversity represents an extraordinary potential to persist as environments change through time. And this research shows that the opposite is also true, that the loss of that diversity increases vulnerability to the system at every scale. All right. So I think biodiversity is pretty. How's it doing? this is like, the part of the plot where there's the crisis moment. That's it. This is the crisis moment. It's not doing very well. Genetic diversity, according to the FAO of the UN, 70% of the genetic diversity in our crop plants, and our crop plants now, like the major crop plants, like our 5 major crops, account for 60% of our caloric intake as a species. We used to be generalists, feeding on like anything we could find. We are now highly specialized on these crop plants, dependent upon them. Yet they've lost 70% of their genetic diversity over the last 75 years. We've shifted to industrial farming and the use of genetically modified strains. An Archer-Danger Midlands creates a genetically modified strain, and they take a gene from a bacterium and they pop it into a cotton plant. That's only half the battle. That's the easy part. Then they've got to get that gene to actually turn on in that cotton plant and actually produce the protein that it encodes for. And that protein then can actually protect that cotton against boll weevils. Well, once, ADM invests hundreds of millions of dollars in this research and development, and they've got a cultivar that is protected against the boll weevil, they're not going to do it a second time. They're going to mass produce this cultivar and sell it across the entire country. So some extraordinary fraction, like 90% of our corn and 90% of our cotton, are single genetic cultivars that have very little genetic variation. Of course, one thing that correlates with genetic variation is population size. Large populations have lots of different individuals that can then represent higher degrees of genetic variation. As populations shrink and there's fewer individuals, there's less genetic variation. This is a fairly recent figure from data from 2022 from World Wildlife Fund and Zoological Society of London. It's data that was compiled by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which monitors populations. This data is a summary of results of the abundance of 31,000 different populations representing 5,000 different species, all marine, terrestrial, freshwater, animals, plants. And what we see is an average decline in their abundance, number of individuals in the population, by 70%. And what's even more remarkable is, even though we have this extraordinary variation in the types of organisms, the variation is pretty tight. 95% confidence intervals, the range is 63 to 75%. 95% of the populations are declining within that range. Well, that's not good for genetic diversity. Populations are shrinking. This is a study of insect populations, insect abundance, biomass of insects per 100 sweeps through the vegetation in the mid-70s to the mid-teens. 70% drop in insect biomass. We all experience that anecdotally. It's known as the windshield effect. I got my driver's license in 74, 75. Every time I stopped for gas, I used the squeegee, not just to wipe off dirt, but dead bugs. Don't have to do that anymore, not nearly as often. Where'd they go? Where'd they go? And of course, insects are important components of every ecosystem because they're detritivores. They eat dead stuff and they convert it into their own biomass, which is then eaten by small mammals, other insects, birds. And it keeps that energy then in the animal food chain. Otherwise, that tree would be digested by bacteria and fungi, and nutrients would be released to the soil that would get absorbed by trees. But that takes a lot longer in order to be recycled. The insects maintain that energy in a system much more tightly. Species diversity. We're in the 6th major mass extinction event in the Earth's history. 1,000 Pacific Island bird species have gone extinct. since human colonization. It's 15% of the global total of bird species. About 7% of mussel species in North America have gone extinct. 60% are endangered. And about 5% of fish species in North America have gone extinct, and 35% are threatened or endangered. They're walking the razor's edge. Ecosystem diversity. Well, ecosystems are shrinking. We've lost 35% of mangrove habitat in the last 20 years. Mangroves are important coastal habitats in the tropics. In the temperate zone, our coastal habitats are salt marsh, and they act as a big sponge and absorb that storm surge. Mangroves satisfy the same function along with coral reefs in the tropics as storm breaks. We've lost 35% of mangroves. Hard corals in the Caribbean have declined by 80% in the last 20 years, and we've lost an area of old growth forest the size of Texas. It's no surprise why. It's us, obviously. In 1700, 95% of the land surface area of our planet was represented by this white bar, semi-natural, and this light green bar, wild. And up top, if that wasn't there, only 5% was anthropically controlled, human controlled. In 2000, here's our semi-natural and wild areas, 45%. And this bar of anthropic anthrome is 55%. What happened in that last 300 years? Well, one species grew from 600 million individuals to over 8 billion individuals. And if we think of that terrestrial biomass, as I mentioned before, as food, well, one species growing that much over 300 years now uses 40% of the terrestrial food production on our planet. So it should be no surprise at all that lots of other species have nowhere to live and nothing to eat. It's no surprise at all. We are indeed driving other species to extinction through habitat conversion, habitat loss. Reducing the size of the habitat reduces those populations in number, reduces their genetic diversity, reduces and increases their probability that their population will just randomly bounce to zero. Of course, that's not the only threat. And this is, again, just another way to just represent this. Is all just surprises me every time I look at it. We're looking at global biomass, is the figure on the left. And as you would suspect, plants represent the majority of the global biomass. Well, they're at the bottom of every food web. So there has to be more plants than anything else. Here's the fraction of animal biomass. So let's pop that up and look at that in more detail. Most of it is arthropod biomass, either terrestrial insects or marine. Of course, the planet's covered by 75% by ocean, so there's going to be a lot of marine animal life. And of course, in the vertebrates as well. Well, the most diverse and abundant vertebrates are the fishes in those aquatic habitats, representing the greatest share of vertebrate biomass. But what's just blows me away every time I look at it, here's wild mammal biomass. Here's human biomass. There's 10 times more human biomass than all the biomass of, whales are pretty big, they're mammals, but there aren't many of them left. At the other end of the spectrum, you got millions of mice and rats, but they're really small. Deer, lions, tigers, bears, all of them. 1/10 the biomass is this one species of mammal. Birds, even less. The livestock that we raise to feed ourselves, as you would suspect from food pyramids, there's got to be more biomass in the food than in the animals that eat them. Yeah, there's more livestock biomass. You add the human component of us and our food together, and you're 20 times greater biomass than wild mammal biomass.
Couple of words there, protist and
Protists. So the protists are single-celled things like amoeba and paramecium. And also algae are classically considered protists, but they may be popped into the plants here, I fear. Then the cnidarians. The cnidarians are corals, jellyfish, hydra. And the archaeans in the upper left of the first box are prokaryotic cells, bacteria-like cells, but another type of prokaryote.
More mollusk than human biomass.
More mollusk than human biomass. That's right. So that's good. So we can eat a lot of bivalves. Squid, octopus. That's probably what we'll do. All right, invasive species. So we move species all over the planet. Invasive predators and invasive diseases are probably the primary causes of extinctions on island communities where we have species that didn't adapt to the presence of a particular disease or a presence of a particular predator. The Hawaiian archipelago had 142 endemic species of birds found nowhere else on the planet. 95 of them are currently extinct, and 11 others have not been seen for decades and are also likely extinct. Basically, and 33 others are endangered. So 90% of the endemic birds in the Hawaiian archipelago are either extinct or endangered. Overexploitation, we of course have hunted many species to extinction or have driven their populations so low that they don't behave correctly, like passenger pigeons were really a classic example of hunting them, killing them to the point where their populations were so low they really didn't know how to reproduce with one another unless they were in a flock of hundreds of thousands. Pollution and climate change. We kill a lot of species as a consequence of the waste we produce, and I include carbon dioxide as a waste. This species here, our little bramble K. malomes, little mouse, is the first species to be unequivocally identified as going extinct due to climate change. It lived on a small island between Papua New Guinea and Australia. With sea level rise, the forests of those islands were inundated with salt, the forests died back, and the species of mouse went extinct. These factors don't act independently. They act synergistically and create a vicious cycle of progressive species loss. Through habitat loss, pollution, climate change, and invasive predators, we have a reduction in population size and reduced genetic variation, either directly as a consequence of less habitat for them to use, or as a result of increased physiological stress because there's a change in the environment and a weakened immunity and interrupted reproduction. And of course, pollution and climate change and invasive predators also reduce available habitat. So if rats have colonized an island and they're all along the beachfront, well, animals that used to live there now are restricted to a smaller habitat. If we consider a population that lives at a particular elevation in the mountains where it's cool, as a result of climate change, that range shifts up the mountain. Well, the mountain's a cone. Eventually, their range disappears off the top of the mountain. So there are interactive effects which ultimately reduce the populations and genetic variation of these species, which makes them more susceptible with reduced genetic variation to diseases. And eventually, we have a species going extinct. And of course, when one species in a community goes extinct, what does that do? That reduces the diversity in the community. And what does that effect of reduced diversity have on the stability of the community? The ability of that community to resist environmental change, or the resilience of that community in response to environmental change? It reduces that resistance and resilience, making that community more sensitive to subsequent changes in habitat loss, climate change, or invasive species. So it's a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle. So how do we save it? How do we break this vicious cycle? Right, right. Yeah, easy. We just identified the 4 things that are killing species off. So stop doing these things. Simple. No problem. No problem. Stop doing these things. Well, we need to protect, augment, and connect natural habitats. One of the great contributions of ecology is the theory of island biogeography that explains this pattern that we see at every spatial scale on the planet. Larger habitats support more species than smaller habitats. For 2 reasons. A larger habitat provides more food to each species, so each population will be larger and less likely then to bounce to a size 0 in extinction. In addition, larger habitats have more niches, so there are homes for more different species. So we need to protect the ones we have and add to them. But the effect that we have had is not just in reducing the size of available habitat, of total habitat, but chopping it up into little isolated islands. So we have an additional problem when it comes to conservation. What decision? We have to make decisions. We've only got so much time, energy, and money. We're trying to conserve these natural areas. What should we do? Should we protect single large areas or several small areas? Well, a single large area is going to have more species than any one of the smaller areas due to that species area relationship. But if the small areas are very different habitats, they might collectively have more species on them than the one large island, one large habitat. So that's what you see here, that actually the top line are sets of habitat, which contain more species, that's the y-axis, than the dotted line of a single area of equal size. So down here, we're looking at 8 islands of actually prairie grasses that are in total 1 million square meters versus one single plot that's 1 million square meters. And our several small plots have greater diversity because they have different things on them and collectively a total of more species.
Are they connected?
They're not. Those small areas are isolated islands. But that's not typical. Typically, smaller islands will house the same species because extinction is non-random. And the species that you're going to lose when you reduce a large area to a small one isn't random, and you'll lose the same group of species from all those small areas, and there will be the same ones that persist. So the species that we have on small islands will all be the same, and as the islands get bigger, as the habitat gets bigger, we'll add some that can persist on a medium-sized island, and add some that can persist on a slightly larger island, and we end up with what's called nested subset structure. In that case, the only way to preserve all the species is preserve the biggest habitat. If they're not nested, like in the previous experiment, well then yeah, a bunch of different islands that are preserving different species can collectively protect more species.
So different environments, different.
Those are, could be different patches of forest.
Where not necessarily.
Could still different patches of forest, but maybe they're different elevations. So they're slightly different environments. Yeah. Although not necessarily, but that would be the most likely explanation. So what we tend to see when we see nestedness is a structure of occupancy that looks like this. So what we're looking at here, you might recognize the Four Corners region with Mexico and Arizona. And the black areas are what are called sky islands. They're habitat at particular elevations that create forested habitat, where between them we have desert and scrub and dry environments. So we've got these islands of forested habitat. The islands are different sizes, and the smallest islands have the fewest species. These are the numbers of species on these islands. The species are identified by different letters. So what we see is the smallest islands have species A, B, and C, and D, and those are also present. They are the smallest little nesting doll that's also present in every community that's more diverse on a larger habitat, all the way up to our largest islands, which is the only place where we're seeing species W, X, Y, and Z. So we get this, the matrix here is filled in one corner. It's kind of what we expect to see when we see a nested subset structure. We get this regular addition of species as communities get more species rich. Now, as I mentioned, there are biological reasons for this, because extinction is non-random. Think about our classic little trophic pyramid where we've got plants, and then we've got herbivores that eat the plants and carnivores that eat the herbivores. And of course, the amount of biomass has to decrease as we go up because of the second law of thermodynamics. Energy transformations aren't 100% efficient. So you can't convert all the plant biomass into herbivore biomass, even if they ate every single leaf. Well, suppose we take that land area and we subdivide it into 3 isolated islands. Even if they have the same total area, each one is now an independent island. And the amount of plant biomass might not support the amount of herbivore biomass necessary to support a population of carnivores. So as we subdivide the world's habitats, it's no surprise that carnivores are among our most common endangered species. Lions, tigers, grizzly bears. At the top of the food chain, needing huge, intact habitats to support their populations at the top of this food pyramid. I did an experiment with a different community of flies that lay their eggs on mushrooms. And the larvae then tunnel through the mushroom and they compete with one another. So me and a couple of students, we collected a whole bunch of mushrooms in the woods and brought them back to the lab. And each mushroom we cut right down the middle, assuming that larvae were equally distributed in the 2 mushroom halves. We put one mushroom half in a nice moist environment, and we put the other mushroom half in an incubator that was drier and warmer, that represented an environmental stress to these tiny little larvae. Well, the communities that came out of the mushroom halves that were in the moist environment, focus on the number 1s here. They are not all squished up into a corner like in those sky islands. Actually, the X's here represent departures from perfect nestedness, and there's a way to statistically analyze this. These communities coming out of the halves and the moist environments were not nested, and you can see there's probably 14 or so species there. But the other mushroom halves, placed in a dry environment, first of all, had many fewer species. Some couldn't make it in this dry environment. And those that could exhibit a nested subset structure. Non-random extinction when faced with an environmental stress. Some species are going to be more sensitive to others, and they'll drop out from all the communities wherever they were. So we could start with this problem. Which do we say? The single large area with 12 species, or this assemblage of small areas that collectively have more? but small islands of habitat have smaller populations that are more prone to extinction, and smaller islands of habitat are more sensitive to disturbance. You know that a little woodlot is not a forest. A little woodlot, it dries out because, you know, the actual core habitat in the middle is so small, there's more edge for, you know, wind to dry out the community along the edge. So small habitats are more sensitive to disturbance, and the smaller populations are more vulnerable to extinction. So you stress these communities by, oh, I don't know, let's say cranking up the temperature across the planet, and you're going to get non-random extinction and end up with nested communities and lower total diversity. And you'll be saying, dang, I wish I'd saved that big, huge habitat instead of all these little woodlots that have the same things on them now after the interesting stuff went extinct. So we need to protect large intact areas. We also need to add to them. This is the protected land in the United States, including federal, state, individual landowners, nonprofits, and others. Tiny little dots. I mean, Missouri looks like, you know, polka dots. We've got some big islands left, that's for sure, but that's not going to do it. That's not going to preserve the biodiversity of a continent. We need to add. We need to add to these islands, increase their size. Because when we increase the size of an island, the populations can increase and become less vulnerable to extinction. And some habitats can recover real quickly. This is actually in the Atlantic forest of Brazil, tropical forest biome. And so, you know, it's great for plants all year round. And in 20 years, you've got intact canopy forest there. And a lot of animals will migrate into the forest once you've got an intact canopy. A lot of the mammals, there's golden lion tamarins in the Atlantic forest that has driven a lot of conservation work. And so they will move in to where they don't care what branch they're grabbing, what species it is. They'll move in as soon as they have an intact canopy to move through the environment. So we need to grow these islands. In fact, last month at the COP28, you probably heard about it. You know, it's like, well, they did about as much as you're going to do in an oil-producing country. But the IUCN was there trying to encourage nations and their representatives to participate in the 30 by 30 project, which is to conserve 30% of terrestrial inland water in coastal and marine areas by 1930. Actually, the Biden administration is committed to this. And IUCN is the International Union of Conservation and Nature. Currently, globally, only 15% of the land, 7% of oceans are protected. The United States, it's actually a little bit lower, about 13% of the land area. And as you might imagine, you saw the lower 48, that wasn't 13%. There are big chunks in Alaska where we're protecting most of our land area. I actually, as Frank mentioned, studied dragonflies and was in Costa Rica studying dragonflies for a sabbatical. And I compared the dragonfly communities in primary forest at the Santa Elena cloud forest in Monteverde. Maybe some of you have been to Monteverde in Costa Rica. And I also sampled a budding secondary forest that had been regrowing for 40 years. Now, in old fields, when that forest was cut down originally, old field communities are occupied by a completely different suite of dragonflies. So the fact that in this 40-year-old secondary forest, we'd gotten all of the primary forest species back, or 8 of the 9, suggests that, like monkeys, once that canopy is established, as long as your aquatic systems aren't too impacted, systems can return. Populations can increase and colonize those abutting areas. And of course, lastly, we need to connect natural habitats with natural corridors. If we have two isolated plots and a species goes extinct here, probably just a matter of time before it goes extinct here, goes extinct on another island, now it's globally extinct. But if they're connected, if the species goes extinct here, there can be recolonization through that corridor and the species can become reestablished. And even if it goes extinct here then, well, it can be reestablished there too. And thus, although local extinctions can still occur, global extinction is far less likely because extinction won't accumulate across all the different habitats. The Mesoamerican Corridor Project is one of the kind of high-profile international agreements of Central American countries to create corridors of protected habitat between the remaining blocks of intact forest. And as you can appreciate, well, it's been differentially successful in different places due to political instability. And as you can guess, Costa Rica has been most successful in this. In fact, that's why I went to study this particular revegetation project. It was in one of these corridors. But we don't have to go to Costa Rica to see an implementation of this idea. Sierra Club's been involved. The Nature Land Trust has been involved. The state, the counties, and the Nature Conservancy have been involved in buying up land to try and connect the beautiful state parks we have and the protected areas we have, and the Jocassee Gorges area that we have, to try and link up the islands of vegetation, the islands of mountain habitat that we have in the southern escarpment of the Blue Ridge. And they've been really, really successful. Now, when you look, wow, everything is pretty much connected all the way to here. It's just one gap to the west of the Saluda Reservoir.
So the light brown areas are the like corridor areas?
The green areas are the protected areas, but I'm not sure what the light brown areas are. I don't think those are protected. But I'm not positive. Does anybody know? Recognize some of those spots?
They've increased. We've added some land there to Jones Dam.
Right,
State Park, Natural Land Trust, I guess.
right. That would be to the east of the reservoir.
Oh, no, I thought it was.
Was it to the west? Okay, all right. So maybe that is, maybe those are new areas.
Yeah.
All right. So that's even more impressive. Everything's connected. Right. So we need to stop doing those things, do more of these things: protect and augment, connect habitat, eliminate invasive species, protect endangered species at risk, because once they're gone, they're gone. And of course, reduce carbon emissions so that we don't stress the habitats that we have on this planet. If we do this, if we sustain biodiversity and sustain the environment, because of course biodiversity improves the functionality of the biosphere, then we might preserve the societies and the economies that depend on the products of this living environment. And if we don't, then we won't. That's it. So thanks for your time. I probably went a little long, but. Happy to answer any questions you might have. Yeah.
Fantastic presentation. Oops.
Yeah, I agree, Ken. I'm not sure they can hear us and we can't hear them anymore.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. It disappeared.
Well, they're on mute, looks like.
Oh,
Maybe not. Nope, I think I shut down and. Oh, all right.
hey, back again.
Was that Ken? I think it was Ken. You might be.
Yeah.
Hold on just one second.
This one?
Okay. Oh, okay.
So that's our insect biome, a lot of insect biomes. Of course, eating fish is good. Basically, eating lower on the food chain. Because if we think of our trophic pyramid, there's far more energy available in plant biomass than in herbivore biomass, than in carnivore biomass. So eating like, tuna, predatory fish at the top of the food web, well, there's not as much biomass in tuna as there is in sardines. So eating lower on the food web is better. Being an herbivore exclusively is the most energetically efficient. Well, if we're going to eat animal tissue, well, fish is good. There's a lot of it out there. Okay, that's good. They're also more efficient physiologically. Warm-blooded organisms, when we eat quarter pounder, we're going to spend most of the energy in that quarter pounder on keeping our body temperature at 98.6 degrees. And only about 5 to 10% of the energy that we consume in all of our food is actually converted to our own biomass. So we're not very efficient. Other animals, and that's true of mammals in general and warm-blooded animals in general, we're spending, just like we're keeping the fire warm by burning all those logs instead of building something with them. Other animals, cold-blooded animals, are much more efficient. Insects, fish, you're getting to like 30% efficiency. So they are, in terms of the shape of the food pyramid, they're eating plants, but a greater fraction of that energy is being transferred to fish biomass than if a cow eats it. So you need a whole lot more plant food to make a pound of beef than a pound of salmon. It's more efficient. But yeah, so that's where we are. We really don't want to eat any more wild mammals. Not much out there anymore. So yeah, insects are kind of a reasonable choice. We've already done a number on 70% of their biomass too.
Are deer still considered wild mammals?
Yes.
Because land management.
Right.
Land.
Absolutely, absolutely right. But we haven't, they haven't tripped over to livestock yet. Yeah.
The marine arthropods, are those like shrimp?
Yep.
crab?
Lobster, crab. Yep.
That's spiders in the top left
Top
of the left diagram.
left diagram, the archaeans.
Yeah, okay,
No,
so-
those are the prokaryotes, other
Okay.
single-celled, non-nucleated organisms.
Where the spiders? Oh,
Spiders are gonna be arthropods. They are probably
so what?
jammed in with the insects, I bet. It's kind of divided, like we would probably say,
Mhm.
aquatic and terrestrial, so I'd probably pop them in.
Are you one of these?
Then we got worms up here, a lot of worms.
I watch spiders eat massive amounts of insects and roaches and stuff.
Mhm.
I mean, like moldy body, their body weight. The spiders must eat their body weight constantly.
They're pretty efficient.
They're doing the job of the stink bugs right now.
I saw a show that I bet you would be a huge cheerleader for. Patrick McMillan was talking about the wall in Mexico and how disastrous that is for exactly what
Right.
you're talking about.
Yeah, migration across that barrier, absolutely. And it's actually happening in an unfortunate time. The historic range of jaguar ranged up into the lower 48, ranged up, and there have actually been camera traps within the last 10 years that have seen recorded jaguar in the boot heel in New Mexico. But put up that wall, you can forget about the population being established. And predators are really important because they reduce the abundance of herbivores. So the herbivores populations don't compete with one another, and we end up getting a persistence of different species of herbivores. We don't get one out competing another because the population of the competitively superior herbivore is kept low by the predator. And then with fewer herbivores, the plants are not overgrazed. Once we remove those top predators, herbivores increase. The dominant herbivore competitively excludes subordinate species and overgrazes the habitat. So predators are pretty.
I think we have someone online who
Oh.
wanted to ask a question. Ken, did you want to ask a question?
I didn't have one specifically. I just wanted the fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Anything else? I hear there's a business meeting you guys have to get to.
So a fish walking on the razor's edge. Is that just the use of language?
Yeah, that was,
Okay.
that's all. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.